Now, Michael Buerk with the BBC 10 o'clock news.
The Queen Mother lies in state tonight after a day of sombre pageantry. Nearly 500,000 people lined the route as her coffin was brought to Westminster. Prince Charles followed his magical grandmother with 3 generations of royals. And tonight thousands queue for hours in an extraordinary display of public respect. No let-up in the Middle East. The Israeli army says it needs weeks to corner the bombers.
Well, look north with me, Ian White. People here pay their respects to the Queen Mother. Also tonight, a murder investigation's underway in South Yorkshire. And could North Yorkshire be in with a chance in tomorrow's Grand National?
Good evening. At times tonight, the queue to file past the Queen Mother's coffin lying in state at Westminster Hall stretched for 2.5 miles. Tens of thousands of people waited up to 6 hours to pay a personal tribute. Earlier, nearly 500,000 had lined the streets to see her funeral procession, a display of sombre pageantry that hasn't been seen in London for 40 years. Jenny Bond reports.
On a fresh spring day, the sort that she loved, the Queen Mother's coffin was carried from the Queen's Chapel. It was the start of a grand and sombre pageant befitting a former Queen Consort, the last Empress of India. 3 generations of her family lined up behind the gun carriage. For Prince Charles, it was a day he had dreaded. A farewell to a grandmother who, for him, was simply magical. The Princess Royal, in her naval uniform, breaking the tradition that only male mourners take part in the procession. And for William, a sad reminder of the day that he and Harry took their place behind their mother's coffin almost 5 years ago. In the Mall, the crowds, some of the 400,000 gathered along the route, waited to witness a moment in history. As the cortege moved off, the Queen Mother's personal standard above her home, Clarence House, was lowered for the last time. It will never fly again. This was a procession the like of which had not been seen for 40 years. More than 1,600 servicemen and women from the many regiments associated with the Queen Mother escorted her coffin along the way. In all, 14 members of her family marched behind. The Duke of Edinburgh, now 80 years old, flanked by his sons and daughter. On top of the coffin, the crown made for her coronation in 1937. Set with 2,800 diamonds, including the most famous of them all, the Koh-i-Noor. The single wreath of white roses and freesias was from her daughter. The inscription, in loving memory, Lilibet, the Queen's childhood name. With her niece, Lady Sarah Chatto, and the other women of the royal family, the Queen made her way to Westminster Hall by car. Though she seemed composed, she's been greatly saddened by the death of her mother so soon after her sister's and in her Jubilee year. For every minute of the procession, a royal gun salute was fired from Green Park. And along the route, so many landmarks in the Queen Mother's life. The statue of her husband, George VI, her beloved Bertie. His death, half a century ago, had left her bereft. And so onto Horse Guards, the setting for so much ceremonial that the Queen Mother had attended, including the pageant for her 100th birthday. In Whitehall, many who had converged on London for those celebrations were now among the thousands who'd come to pay their last respects. For the Queen Mother's household, as for her family, this was the end of an era. Her private secretary, Sir Alistair Aird, marched behind, with her page, William Talon, following on. The cortege moved on past the Cenotaph, where in November the Queen Mother made one of her last appearances, paying tribute to the war dead, as she did each year. On the stroke of noon, the procession wound its way into the Palace of Westminster. There, the Queen was waiting to receive the coffin. As the 8 pallbearers from the Irish Guards lifted it from the gun carriage, a salute from a granddaughter and a bow from a grandson. For Prince Charles, a moment of uncharted grief. As a choir from Westminster Abbey and the chapels royal sang a psalm for a woman who was herself deeply religious, her coffin was taken to the catafalque, where it will lie for the next 3 days. It was a solemn ceremony, watched by parliamentarians of all parties. The Archbishop of Canterbury said 2 simple prayers.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father, Almighty and everlasting God, we remember before Thee our sister, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. We give thanks for her example of faithful duty and unwearied service, and for the loyalty and love which she inspired.
Then silence as the gold processional cross from Westminster Abbey was carried to the head of the coffin. 50 years on from the lying in state of George VI, his widow's coffin now rests on exactly the same spot. She's become only the 2nd Queen Consort of modern times to be afforded this honour. Her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, was the other. Officers of the Household Cavalry were the first to take their place for the round-the-clock vigil that's been mounted. And with that guard in place, the Queen and Duke left the hall. There was a word of thanks for those who'd officiated, and for a moment, the Queen's stoic refusal to give in to her feelings seemed to slip. The service had been as brief and simple as the procession had been grand, and as the Queen and Duke drove back to the palace, a wave of sympathetic applause followed them, from crowds by now up to 20 deep. It was recognition not only of the woman they were mourning, but of the daughter left behind. And so, beneath the ancient beams of this medieval hall, the Queen Mother is now lying in state. On Monday evening, there'll be a final tribute from her 4 grandsons when they take the place of the guards and stand vigil at each corner of her coffin. Their own salute to the grandmother Prince Charles called so gloriously unstoppable. Jenny Bond, BBC News.
Within an hour of the doors of Westminster Hall being opened this afternoon, more than 20,000 people had filed past the Queen Mother's coffin to pay their respects. Robert Hall spoke to some of them.
The muffled beat of the military drums, summoning the loyal and the curious, drawn together by an extraordinary event, touched by the scenes unfolding before them. Families like the McVeans, who had arrived here soon after dawn.
I understand what it's like to lose somebody, because I lost my granddad, and it's really upsetting.
Ahead, along the route, realisation that an era had ended, that these crowds, packed 10 deep behind the barriers, would be part of tomorrow's headlines.
She's always been there for us. For me, she's been like a grandmother to me, really. She's wonderful.
Well, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and she was a once-in-a-lifetime person.
The McVeans, with thousands of others, reaching out for a moment to another grieving family.
They all look so brave, and it must have been very difficult for those, particularly the younger members of the family, to be walking past all those people, and yet everybody's heart was going out to them.
But the public act of remembrance was to continue, a patient thread of humanity stretching over a mile, crossing and recrossing the Thames to reach its destination. Many of those filing through Westminster Hall recalled the death of Winston Churchill. Some, like Irene Dobson from Brighton, paused to gaze at the draped coffin and its silent guardians.
And it was just lovely to be in there, in that wonderful building. I've never been in there before, and just to see the coffin draped with the crown on the top.
Fueled by volunteers, but facing 4 hours of painfully slow progress, the footsore crowd was weary but undeterred.
I know that the Queen Mother was a very lovely person, so I just wanted to come give thanks.
Yes, I can tell you it's well worth it. I saw Churchill, and it's the grandest sight that you can imagine.
The plan had been to close the doors by dusk, but faced with these numbers, there was only one option. 6 hours after these queues first formed, they are finally beginning to diminish. Many people unable to explain why they've waited so patiently for so long, except to say they felt they were doing the right thing at the right time. Robert Hall, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell is outside Westminster Hall now. Nick, the doors were meant to be closed at 6 o'clock tonight. What's happening there now?
Here we are, 4 hours later, Mike, and Westminster Hall is still open. People are still going in. There is no suggestion that Westminster Hall is about to close. We can see the scenes inside Westminster Hall now. There, the catafalque and a steady stream of people still going in. They think the latest estimate we have is that about 30,000 people have come through in the 8 hours since Westminster Hall opened. And no pressure on them, lingering, taking their time. And I went in a short time ago. You can get in a matter of minutes now. And people, again, lingering, not wanting to leave Westminster Hall, leave the site of the catafalque with the 4 yeomen of the guard, one at each corner of it, with their halberts reversed and their heads bowed. So people still coming, Westminster Hall still open.
It's been an extraordinary display of individuals, so many individuals' respect, that's taken even the palace by surprise.
I don't think anybody would have confidently predicted that we would have seen scenes today comparable to what happened with Sir Winston Churchill's lying in state or the lying in state of George VI 50 years ago. But we have seen scenes comparable to that. The length of the queue, people waiting for 6 hours to get into Westminster Hall. And what struck me is that so many of them are young people, families. Now, there is undoubtedly a curiosity, a wish to be part of this historic occasion, but there is also, I think, a widespread recognition of the Queen Mother's part in and contribution to the history of this nation, and I think a wish to show respect and also to show gratitude to her and perhaps also to her generation for standing up to evil in the Second World War.
Nick, thanks very much. In the Middle East, Israeli forces have continued to attack Palestinian targets across the West Bank, despite President Bush's calls for a ceasefire. An Israeli strike near Jenin killed 6 Palestinians this afternoon. And in Bethlehem, the standoff between Palestinian gunmen and Israeli troops at the Church of the Nativity has continued. From there, Ola Gerin reports.
Smoke rising over Jenin. The Israeli assault goes on today. This is as close as the cameras can get. The area has been sealed off. No one can be sure of the death toll here or in other towns in the West Bank. America saying stop. Israel still pressing ahead. And still keeping the media well back. Firing stun grenades at journalists today, barring them from a key meeting between America's envoy, Anthony Zinni, and Yasser Arafat. And in Bethlehem today, more tension, more fear, and more destruction. Nafme took me to see the home she fled. Her first return, soldiers still close. We couldn't risk being seen.
Why they did this? I didn't do anything. I was just hiding at my parents' home.
And while she did, her modest house was destroyed.
Do you think that President Bush can do anything to help you now?
Nobody can help me. God only can help me.
Nearby, the streets coming to life. The war goes on, but the curfew lifted for a while. This is a taste of freedom. For the first time in days, families here are outside their houses. They're hoping to get a little food if they can find it. They know President Bush is applying pressure and they're hoping Israel will be forced to pull out. But they're worried about what may happen between now and then. Other worries in Jerusalem today, police checking the buses, searching for the next suicide bomber. America says the assault must end, but for now, Israel is still on guard and still fighting in the West Bank. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Bethlehem.
The crisis in the Middle East is expected to dominate talks between Tony Blair and President Bush this weekend. They're due to begin at the Bush family ranch in Texas later tonight. As well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the two are expected to discuss the possibility of military action against Iraq.
Bush country, Texas. A world away from the West Bank, but as Crawford prepares to host Tony Blair, the talk here is of Middle East turmoil and how to get back from the brink. The summit souvenirs arrived here before the Prime Minister, but his Middle East message was on US TV this morning.
The two sides are so locked in conflict like that, they can't get together without an external force bringing them together. And I think we've got to deepen that process. It's one of the things, obviously, I will discuss with the President over the course of the next few days.
It is a close alliance, if not a real personal friendship, forged over intimate meetings like this one at Camp David. But London and Washington are not entirely united on the challenges that lie ahead. Saddam Hussein was supposed to be top of the agenda this weekend. George Bush wants to engineer his downfall. Mr. Blair has backed the US position. But in recent days, Britain's top diplomats have been downplaying the war option.
It was never going to be a council of war, even if we hadn't had the crisis in the Middle East deepening. How you deal with Saddam Hussein in the next months or years or whatever is an issue for Britain and the United States to work together in tandem and with others. No decisions have been taken, and nothing of a military kind is imminent.
In fact, ending Israel's occupation of Palestinian cities may hold the key to much more than restoring calm to the West Bank. The continued viability of the so-called global war on terror may be at stake.
After September the 11th, George Bush portrayed a battle between good and evil. You're either with us or against us, he said. But this Middle East crisis has forced the Americans to acknowledge that diplomacy can be complicated. And it's those complications that Bush and Blair will be focused on this weekend. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Crawford, Texas.
Well, our political editor, Andrew Marr, is in Texas. Andrew, what's Tony Blair hoping to achieve over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, first of all?
Well, he brings with him the bones of a plan, something he's been discussing by telephone with President Bush, and it does require a move on both sides. Effectively, what he's going to be doing is trying to support President Bush in what has been a remarkable U-turn. All the way through this administration has tried to keep out of direct involvement in the Middle East. They are now being drawn in almost hour by hour. And they're going to be discussing quite practical things like it's all very well asking Yasser Arafat to stop the suicide bombings, but he has almost no infrastructure to do that. I mean, his infrastructure at the moment consists of about one telephone that doesn't work. So how do you support him? And above all, what happens if, as we're now 24 hours after President Bush's speech, if the Israelis continue to simply ignore him. Colin Powell, who's going out there on Sunday, has just put out a statement pleading with the Israelis again to pull out of those towns as soon as possible. But there is a real sense of worry here that they're simply not going to do that.
As Stephen was saying, this meeting was billed as the meeting where some decisions might be taken about military action against Saddam. Is Tony Blair likely to prove a restraining influence, do you think?
He does not regard himself as a restraining influence at all. The word that is being used in number 10, quite remarkably, I think, is that Tony Blair regards himself as President Bush's strategist when it comes to Iraq. He is as keen, at least as keen, as President Bush to see the end of Saddam Hussein and wants him out. What they will be discussing is how to get there. A very, very careful series of moves, initially talking about getting the inspectors back in, not thinking that that's going to happen, working with the other Arab countries. Tony Blair is close to, relatively close to the Syrians at the moment, which the Americans are not, and then building up, if you like, world propaganda before what I still think is likely to involve military action, not this year, but next year. These are going to be extremely private, very, very dangerous conversations.
Andrew Marr, thanks very much. The lead guitarist with the rock group REM has been found not guilty of causing a disturbance on a British Airways flight. Peter Buerk had been accused of a drunken rampage and assaulting an air stewardess on a transatlantic flight from Seattle to London a year ago. He said a sleeping pill had turned most of the 10-hour flight into a mental blank. Rail services across northern England and North Wales have been disrupted by strikes. Staff at Arriva Trains Northern walked out last night in a 48-hour strike over pay, and 700 drivers at First North West have staged a 24-hour walkout over a disciplinary matter. The war in Bosnia, that claimed thousands of lives during years of brutal ethnic fighting, began 10 years ago this weekend. Serbian forces, backed by Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade, launched a military campaign designed to expel Bosnia's Muslim and Croat population. 250,000 died over 3 years. The war ended with the Dayton Peace Accord, which created two entities of roughly equal size, one for the Muslims and Croats, the other Serb. Dayton may have ended the war, but as Alan Little reports, the agreement still perpetuates divisions that fueled the conflict.
A routine checkpoint turns into an armed standoff, potentially explosive. But for once in Bosnia, the guns are not real. Cadets at Sarajevo's police academy are part of a painful process of ethnic bridge building. These are young Serbs joining the police in the Muslim and Croat half of Bosnia. It's an attempt to rebuild multi-ethnicity.
Kids must grow up together, Serbs, Croatians, Muslims. It's okay, it's good, you know, to people to live together.
Is there any tension here between Serbs, Croats and Muslims?
No.
There's no difference between us. We are one. For me, it's not a problem he is Muslim or no. It's like my brother or my sister.
And what, are you Muslim?
No, I'm Serbian.
But drive a few miles east and that idealism disappears. This is Republika Srpska, the land that ethnic cleansing built. Mirsada Tabakovic is a Muslim. She is taking us back to the hometown from which she was expelled a decade ago, Visegrad in eastern Bosnia. Her husband disappeared when the war began. His body was found in a mass grave only last year. Most of those who ethnically cleansed Visegrad are still at large. Mirsada took us back to her house. A Serb family lives there now. It's really hard for me to explain, she says. I feel humiliated and miserable. It's not just me, there are thousands of others who can't go home.
Under this ethnic partition, Bosnia is politically paralyzed and sliding into poverty. It's on course to replace Albania at the bottom of Europe's economic league tables, the new Balkan basket case. Its neighbors, Croatia and Serbia, now enjoy reformist governments. Those countries who conspired a decade ago to tear Bosnia apart have now begun the journey to European integration. Bosnia is being left behind.
The guns may be silent, but ethnic division triumphed here, and it persists. Alan Little, BBC News, Sarajevo.
Pakistan's military president Pervez Musharraf is to hold a referendum next month, seeking to extend his term in office. In a televised speech, Mr. Musharraf said he wants the people of Pakistan to decide his future. It's thought he'll ask for another 5 years in power. Opposition groups have criticised his decision as a breach of the constitution. The Northern Ireland Police Service produced its first new uniform and first set of recruits today. The service, which replaced the Royal Ulster Constabulary last year, hopes to attract an equal number of Catholics and Protestants into its ranks.
The first 44 new members of the new police service on parade. They were recruited specifically to be 50% Protestant and 50% Catholic. And they start their careers on the day that the new uniform and crest replaced the old RUC symbols. A new flag was raised too, and at once dipped to half-mast as a mark of respect to the Queen Mother. The former Chief Constable, who once characterised the RUC's ethos as white, Protestant and male, oversaw the transition from that to what he called a new beginning in policing.
We will cherish the very best of the past. We will build on the foundations of all that should be cherished in the past to go on to provide a better, safer, more prosperous future for all our people.
On the face of it, this was just another passing out parade, but it was a genuinely significant moment in Northern Ireland's history, the start of a new era in policing. But the problems that the new officers and the rest of the force face remain. Policing a deeply divided society, sections of which utterly reject the police. But on a day of change, they kept one tradition. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Belfast.
Well, it's 26 minutes past 10. I'll be back a little later with a summary of the day, but now we join our news teams across the UK.
Good evening and welcome to Look North. I'm Ian White. As we've seen, today has been dominated by events in London. The ceremonial procession of the Queen Mother's coffin to Westminster was seen by around 400,000 onlookers and many more millions worldwide on television. Many from our area played their own part in the event, as Kathy Killick reports.
For most of us, this is the closest we'll get to the ceremony surrounding the Queen Mother's death. The residents here at Grove Court Nursing Home in Leeds spent a quiet morning watching the procession in London. Many remember the King's funeral in the days before such events were televised.
You couldn't see things before, but now we can see it all now. Might just as well be there.
She lived a long life, which was nice. She's been ill, and thank God he took her so gracefully.
Others from the region could play a more direct role. Hundreds of specially selected servicemen and women took part in the procession, including soldiers from the 9th and 12th Royal Lancers. The Queen Mother was their Colonel-in-Chief, and she met one of them, Corporal Craig Broadhurst from Dewsbury, several times.
A huge honour, you know what I mean? Probably one of the best things I'm ever going to do in the time I've spent in the army. You know what I mean? She's a fine lady. I'd met her on a couple of occasions when she's visited the regiment, and you know what I mean? I was more than happy to do it.
In Bradford, the Pakistani community chose today to open a book of condolence, especially for contributions from Asians living in Manningham.
Queen Mother happened to be a likeable personality for everyone. Very uncontroversial, very kind, very compassionate.
The crowds proved the Queen Mother touched many during her long life. Today, people across our region have found as many ways to pay their respects.
Detectives in South Yorkshire are investigating the murder of a disabled man who died after being assaulted in his home. Douglas Slight, who was 53, suffered severe head injuries in the attack at his house in the Highfields area of Doncaster 17 days ago. Police say there was property missing from his home.
We believe it was a burglary offence. We treated it as an aggravated burglary at the time because of the injuries sustained by Mr. Slight. Obviously, now that he's died, it's developed into a murder investigation.
A man's in hospital after being shot outside a Sheffield pub. He and a fellow customer at the Golden Keys pub in Westfield were shot at after challenging two other men they thought were acting suspiciously. Amanda Harper reports.
Detectives returned to the scene this morning as the investigation continued into the shooting outside this Sheffield pub. It was at around 10 o'clock last night when two customers of the Golden Keys pub gave chase after seeing some men acting suspiciously. When the men challenged them, they were shot at and, despite a struggle, they escaped. It was only after the incident that one of the men realised that he'd been shot in the stomach and stabbed in the leg. He's currently recovering in hospital.
And he is bang, bang, bang at the top where the police car is. And I come down and I see Lee come about 20 yards. He lifted his T-shirt up and he's bleeding profusely. So I come straight across and went in to see how he were.
So far, detectives are unsure of a motive and are appealing for witnesses to come forward.
What we are looking at is whether or not this incident is connected with another that occurred about 3 hours before, where there was a disturbance outside the pub and some damage was caused to a white Ford Sierra motor car.
The wanted men are described as black, around 5 foot 9 inches tall, and wore balaclavas and dark clothing.
A nationwide manhunt is underway after a convicted murderer from Bradford escaped his guard while on a shopping trip. 35-year-old Keith Downey disappeared in Birmingham city centre yesterday while on a familiarisation visit from Featherstone prison in Wolverhampton. Police say members of the public should not approach him. Sport now, and Sheffield United has been charged with 6 offences following the so-called Battle of Bramall Lane. Players Patrick Suffo, George Santos and Keith Curle will face an FA disciplinary panel following the abandoned match against West Brom last month. Manager Neil Warnock has been charged with improper conduct but cleared of forcing the game to be abandoned. The club itself has been charged with failing to control its players. Now, it's the highlight of the racing year this weekend, the Grand National, and there's plenty of local interest this time round. One North Yorkshire stable is sending out 4 runners. Tanya Arnold has been trying to spot a winner.
You have to go back to the 60s for the last time a Midland-trained horse won the National. This year, Ferdy Murphy is going for broke, sending out 4 horses in the hope the title comes back to North Yorkshire. Now, when you're looking for a national winner, it's often good to look for the one with a story to tell. Paris Pike certainly has that. A world beater 2 years ago, he nearly lost his life after reacting badly to a local anaesthetic.
In normal circumstances, I think we would have lost him, but he's a very good patient and tough, and he came out well, Richard Guest came and sat on him during the week, and he jumped the national type fence that we built here in Midland really well. So we're getting very excited about him.
He's the pick of Ferdy's 4, but the region has 2 other representatives, Sue Smith's The Last Fling and Peter Beaumont's Nicky D. So are any of them worth a bet?
I think Paris Pike of Ferdy Murphy's has got the best chance. Last year's winning jockey Richard Guest has got the ride, a spare ride, because Adrian Maguire's injured, unfortunately. So Richard knows what it's like to win a national, and Ferdy's still got his fingers crossed. With 4 chances, I think he's got a great chance.
The important thing is that they all come back safe and sound, but it is about time Yorkshire saddled the winner.
And fingers crossed for your horse tomorrow. Well, finally, let's check out the weekend weather. Dry with clear spells tonight. Chilly easterly winds, a minimum temperature of 3 degrees Celsius. Tomorrow, any early mist will soon lift, and then it'll be dry and bright with some sunshine. Still feeling cold in the fresh winds and a top temperature of 12 degrees Celsius. And that's all from Look North for tonight and for this week. Join us over the weekend for our bulletins at tea time. Now, though, back to London for the main news again. Good night.
The Queen Mother lies in state tonight after a day of sombre pageantry on the streets of London. Nearly 500,000 people lined the route as her coffin was brought to Westminster. Prince Charles followed his magical grandmother with 3 generations of royals. And tonight, thousands have queued for hours in a moving display of public respect. Newsnight starting now over on BBC 2, but from the 10 o'clock news, good night.
Hello there, good evening. For the thousands of people in London today, well, it was beautifully sunny, but it was a wee bit cooler than yesterday. Temperatures around 16 Celsius with an easterly breeze. And tomorrow it will feel colder. We're dragging in quite a brisk easterly, dragging that cold air right across the British Isles. And that wind stays with us all weekend in the south, even gale force winds in the Channel. Whilst further north, the winds drop out quite quickly. So here not feeling too chilly, but there will be some cold nights. Clear skies mean a fairly widespread frost in Scotland and parts of northern England and Northern Ireland. Another frost to follow on Sunday night as well in the north. Probably by the start of the new week, there's too much breeze for significant problems in the north, but by then, maybe even a little bit of ground frost in the south. So that's something for gardeners to bear in mind. But back to what we've had today, and we've had a little bit of rain in the far southwest, but we have been watching clouds streaming its way westwards across the North Sea. That's now arriving in eastern parts of Scotland, and that'll continue to move its way westwards overnight. So that'll prevent a frost for most places, and there'll be a little bit of mistiness over the hills as well. So tomorrow morning, not clear blue skies to start with for the north, but I think the cloud breaking up quite quickly, not an extensive cloud sheet by any means. So the sunshine becoming quite widespread through the day, and it will be a lovely afternoon. A lot of sunshine to look forward to, and yet again, a lovely day at Aintree. 3 days in a row, smashing for the racegoers, and the Grand National meet, of course, tomorrow afternoon. Temperatures, though, lower than yesterday at around, well, 13 degrees, I should think, and there will be a cold east wind too. Coverage on Grandstad from 1 o'clock. Temperature-wise, then, you can see really quite a contrast from west to east. Only around 8 or 9 degrees tomorrow afternoon, so around Bridlington or Newcastle. Particularly cold in that wind, but further west with a bit of shelter, you may do okay, maybe 14 degrees in the Isle of Skye, possibly 15 Celsius in some sheltered parts of northwest Wales. And then for Sunday's forecast, again, still that cold wind, especially in the south. Still some very strong winds actually along the Channel coast. For the rest of us, though, with a bit of shelter, we'll have a lot of fine weather, quite warm in the sunshine, but possibly a little bit of a change in that some eastern and possibly more southeastern areas may pick up a bit more cloud through the afternoon. And then for the start of the new week, those winds fall light in the south. As I said, it could be quite a chilly night on Monday night here, but a fine day anyway, lots of sunshine. But watch this low, that starts to develop as it pushes up into Iceland, and I think we'll probably lose the fine weather in Scotland by then as rain gathers from the north. Have a good weekend, though.